This is the second in a series of lectures by Dr. Herbert Marcuse. Here is Dr. Marcuse.
Last Tuesday, I tried to discuss with you some of the objective forces and tendencies in our society which may make for radical social change, and I tried to evaluate in very general terms the prospects of the radical opposition. Tonight, I will try to have a look at the human beings who are on the way or are supposed to be on the way working for radical social change, and I shall try to identify as well as I possibly can what is in their mind, well, I should almost say, and what is in their bodies, as you will see, because one thing I want to stress from the beginning: if what I have to say sounds fantastic, very far removed from reality, idealizing, romanticizing, the answer I have is that unless we can get ourselves to become aware of the full scope and depth of the social change that may be ahead, we may miss some opportunities. Now, before I discuss these new subjects of change, and I may say to my great joy, quite a few of them are among you here, I would like, in a very brief restatement, outline the new character of social change today, the new character of social change in the advanced capitalist countries. Three things I think we have to keep in mind. First, that if there should be such a change, or in short, a revolution, it will be generated at a high level of productivity and consumption for the majority of the population. And therefore, we have a phenomenon which seems to be new in history, namely the displacement of the revolutionary potential from the traditional groups considered to be potentially revolutionary to minority groups, and even to minority groups that seem to be on the margin of the social process. Thirdly, this new opposition is, I think, activating dimensions and levels of the human existence which have so far remained more or less unaffected in the historical revolutions, and this opposition is activating these levels of human existence. First, as far as the individual himself is concerned, namely, radicalism today affects the physiological existence of man, his whole organism. And secondly, for the society at large, the revolution is total, in the sense that it would be, and perhaps first of all, a cultural revolution, and that in it the arts, literature, music, and so on, would play a role far more decisive than in any previous revolution. With this third aspect, the last one, I shall deal on Saturday. Today only to the individuals themselves. And here I would suggest that what is at stake today in the work for social change is a new relationship of man to his own nature, that is to say, to his body, to his drives, to his senses, and a new relationship of man to external nature, both these factors as catalysts of social change. Now the emergence of this new dimension of radicalism is, I believe, revealing. It reveals the extent to which the domination of man by man has taken place through the domination of nature. Through the domination of nature in the twofold sense. First, the scientific and technological control, the social control of man's own nature, the social control, the scientific social control of his drives and impulses, even of his unconscious, and this again in two main forms: the technological sublimation of aggressiveness, by which I mean that today the most violent, the most sweeping, the most inhuman acts of aggression hide the subject of aggression, because in these cases all you have to do is press a button or pull a lever and the thing will go and destroy I don't know how many square miles of foodstuff, of forests, of human beings. In other words, the concrete subject of aggression disappears behind the technological veil, and with its disappearance, the sense of guilt, formerly, previously bound up with such aggressiveness, is effectively repressed. After all, it is a machine which does the destruction and not the human being himself. Secondly, the scientific and technological control of human nature, the steering of human instincts and their satisfaction, takes place in what I would like to call the technological desublimation of sexuality. The technological desublimation of sexuality, usually under the title the liberalization of sexual mores and morality, greatly helped and sparked by the beauty industry, by the liberalization of dress or undress, by the pill, other contraceptives, all these which promise and give sexual satisfaction formerly restricted, take place, however, within the well-working framework of effective social repression. All these liberties you have within a repressive society, which of course means something for the value, human value of these liberties. That much for human nature as the object of domination. Now external nature as the object of domination. And there we see it today especially as the object of capitalist domination through the violent and profitable commercial exploitation of nature, through which the life environment of man is transformed in accordance with the laws of profit. Thus, in this twofold sense, Nature has become the extended arm of society, and we can imagine no liberation of man, no emancipation of man, without, literally, a revolution in the sensibility of man and in his relation to external nature. The revolution in the sensibility of man, meaning that without the radical transformation, not only of his consciousness, but also of his modes of perceiving, feeling, hearing, touching and smelling things, without this radical transformation, there can be no real radical change in our society. You may well speak here of a liberation of nature, not only of human nature, but also of external nature, provided that we do not think of any romantic return to a pre-industrial stage, of any such thing as a good savage or whatever it may be. The essential relation between man and nature, which comes to the fore today, which comes to the fore in the changes that is going on in the very sensibility of man, in his impulses and drives, in his body, and not only in his mind, this essential relation between nature and freedom has been tabooed in the history of Western civilization, and it has to a great extent been relegated to the poetic imagination. This relegation and confinement of some of the most radical possibilities of human freedom to the poetic imagination, to fiction, to the arts, this, it seems to me, is being undone today. What is at stake is the uncovering of the roots of liberation in the mind and in the body of man. Or, in other words, a free society presupposes not only new institutions and new relationships of production, not only a break with the dominant rationality that has built these institutions and relations, but also with the basic experience of the world, a break with the familiar sense certainty we have acquired, a break with the manipulated needs and satisfaction to which we have become accustomed. And this break, this emergence of a new type of human being must take place prior to the construction of a new society, because otherwise the chances are that the old Adam is reproduced and that human beings carry over their own repression and their own aggressiveness into the new society. The question was raised on Tuesday: how can one envisage as a realistic possibility that the whole thing does not repeat itself on a higher level, that is to say, domination does not repeat itself in a streamlined and perhaps more rational form? I can see only one way which may counteract this historical tendency, namely that the very men and women who are supposed to make the revolution and to work for it are already of a different type of human being that has, as much as this is possible at all, discarded and emancipated himself from the repressive needs and satisfactions which are part and parcel of the established society. Now, the tendencies toward a new sensibility, which I would like to discuss today, can be summed up in the concept of emancipation of the senses. Emancipation of the senses. You probably know that this is a Marxian concept, that it has been developed at great lengths in the economic philosophical manuscripts of 1844, and it has usually been discarded by Marxists as belonging to the young Marx only, as an immature conception, which has been superseded, and correctly superseded, by the mature economic and political theory. Recently, this traditional interpretation has been corrected, and one has seen how much actuality, how much foresight, how much projection, realistic projection, is precisely in the writings of this period. And still, these writings have, in my view, been read the wrong way. They have been read as the first inklings of what is called today a humanistic socialism, humanitarian socialism, as contrasted with the Stalinist construction of socialism. Now, I believe that the economic philosophical manuscripts have indeed to be reread, but reread not as a document of humanism, but as a document of a conception of socialism far more radical than the one that comes out in the later economic and political theory. And I hope I can at least give you a glance of it tonight. Marx speaks of the emancipation of the senses as the basis for a new rationality. He calls the senses practical. He calls them a productive force. In this respect, he discovers the aesthetic dimension as a political dimension. Some of you may know that I have tried to emphasize what has been happened to the word aesthetic and what is characteristic of the development of bourgeois civilization. It originally meant, I may repeat it very shortly here, it originally meant, that is to say, into the 18th century, pertaining to the senses. That is a meaning. Aesthetic as pertaining to the senses, to the sensibility of man, as contrasted with logic, as pertaining to the mind of man. Then in the 18th century, for reasons which I cannot discuss here, but in a very interesting way, the term aesthetic has been relegated to and restricted to the arts, to the dimension of the arts, literature, the visual arts, and so on. Now, the aesthetic dimension, as Marx rediscovers it in these writings, and as I will use the term now, goes back to the original meaning, namely pertaining to the sensibility of man, if you wish, the science of the sensibility of man, of his senses. I said the aesthetic dimension in this sense is a political dimension. The senses are potentially revolutionary forces, and they are revolutionary forces, especially under the conditions of contemporary capitalism, which depends for its further working on the constant mobilization, stimulation, and modification of human sensibility, of human sensuality. The merchandisers, human as well as objects, the merchandisers produced in the society must be stimulating to the senses. That is the capitalist aesthetics of today. Merchandisers, stuff that has to be bought and sold, exchangeable stuff, but nevertheless highly stimulating and satisfying to the senses. Now, precisely, and I indicated that on Tuesday already, this constant stimulation of the sensibility of man required by the present stage of capitalism may well release forces which undermine the stability of the capitalist system. But instead of speculating further on it, let me come back to the Marxian conception, which implies far more than simply a de-sublimation of the human instincts, far more than mere instinctual liberalization, far more than the individual release of sensuality. What it implies is a new socialization of man, a construction, emergence of new relationships between human beings based on a new experience of the world we live in, and this experience in turn giving rise to a new political practice. I will briefly sum up the principal conception which Marx gives in these writings. Emancipation of the senses. The senses become practical in the reconstruction of the social environment as generating new relationships between men and things, between man and nature. The senses become in this way sources or resources of a new rationality, freed from the rationality of acquisition, competition, and exploitation. That is the preservation and cancellation of the achievements of the technological rationality of the preceding forms of society. Now, what does it mean? That the emancipated senses will generate not only human beings as individuals, but these individuals a new relationship to other individuals. It means negatively that the ego, the other, and the object world are no longer experienced in the context of aggressive acquisition and defensive possession. That means dissolution of the bourgeois ego, which was essentially an ego generated by and based on these acquisitive, defensive, and possessive relationships. It means further negatively that subject and object no longer confront each other as mere items in the struggle for existence, competing in performing a role, but, and here Marx uses a strange term, the emancipation of the senses will result in what he calls the human appropriation of nature.